Hey everybody, what's going on? And welcome back to another episode of the Saturdays in Stores podcast, which you can find right here on the Core Store Media Network. I'm your host, Kanaye, and on today's episode, we have a lot to get into. One loss, one win. Of course, UConn unfortunately suffered a loss at the Garden on prime time last Friday night against St. John's, 81-72. But we were able to bounce back on the road this past Tuesday and take home a win at Hinkle Fieldhouse against Butler, 80-70. So be giving you guys my thoughts, my takeaways from both of those performances out of the Huskies, as well as just a quick preview for some of the games to come. But before we get into all of that today, of course, everyone knows how important the algorithm is on YouTube to getting more people to see the videos that me and Josh put out on the channel. So please engage with our content in any way you can, whether it's liking, subscribing, or just telling other people about the Court Storm. Everything goes a really long way with influencing the algorithm and getting more people to see our videos. Also, be sure to turn on post notifications so you are the first to see our latest content. So let's start with the St. John's loss. Again, UConn lost 81-72. This was probably the premier game in Big East play this year, where everyone going into the season knew UConn and St. John's are going to be at the top of the league. And while it maybe hasn't played out in the fashion that we expected it to, as St. John's maybe isn't a top 10 team, top 5 team in the country the way a lot of people, including myself and Josh, thought that they had a chance to be going into the season. They've been able to figure it out as of late. They had a really tough out-of-conference stretch to start the year. Rick Pitino wanted to challenge this team and have them play a lot of quad one games. They had some bad losses to some teams in the Players Air Festival, but they were able to play pretty close with some of their higher marquee matchups. The loss to Kentucky and Atlanta wasn't all too bad. They only lost to Iowa State by a point. Even if you want to go back as far as the exhibition in the preseason against Michigan, that was only what I believe was maybe a 1 or 2 possession game that ended up being. So they've played up to their competition this year, but they've also played down. I mean, you look at their second game in Big East play, they suffered the loss to Providence at MSG, where they blew a double-digit lead in the second half, and Providence was able to storm back and ultimately beat the Johnnies. And, I think as of late, they were entered a game on an 8-game win streak, if I'm not mistaken. And I think Pitino honestly figured some things out. He figured out what guys are going to give him the best chance to win game in and game out, and what guys he wants to play more, who's going to defend at the highest level, who's going to bring the most offensively. And I think that's why we've seen guys like Dylan Mitchell. Midseason got inserted to the starting lineup. He's been a complete glue guy, driving factor of both their defensive energy and as well as what he can do on the offensive end. I mean, we saw that in the first 8 minutes of the game, which I'll touch on very briefly. And Dylan Darling, those two guys were the biggest factors in this game for St. John's. Of course, Zuby was Zuby. He was great. He's Big East Player of the Year in my book. But I think St. John's does not win this game if it's not for the play that they got out of Dylan Darling off the bench, as well as what Dylan Mitchell was able to do throughout the entirety of the games. Let's get into the actual game. On last week's episode, I talked about how I was going to be really interested to see how both these teams match up with one another defensively. And early on, UConn chose to put Braylon Mullins on Dylan Mitchell. And I talked about it on this week's episode of the Court Storm College Hoops Talk, which I do with Josh, where I was a little confused by the decision to have Mullins guarding Dylan Mitchell. Dylan Mitchell is a legit 6'8". He's athletic. He has great length, great size. He probably has 30 to 40 pounds of weight on Braylon Mullins as well. And I just think that was a matchup that both Mitchell himself and Pitino pointed out early on as something that they wanted to make an issue of attacking. Dylan Mitchell was able to really get to the rim at will in those first 8 minutes. I think he went on like an 8-0 run, within the first 5 minutes of the game. He was able to go on that 8-0 run. I mean, he had the one nice crossover where he was able to get into the lane. Really I think Braylon kind of struggled staying in front of him. I mean, it's tough to guard guys that are that athletic, that possess that much size and length, and can do as much as Dylan Mitchell can do on the perimeter. And Dylan Mitchell's been one of the most pleasant surprises, I think, for Pitino this year. I mean, for the reasons I spoke about just earlier. So I that was definitely one that I was scratching my head slightly at. But on the other hand, Braylon Mullins, he had a really strong start to the game. He hit some tough shots. I believe he got 2 threes to go down in the first half, as well as a couple tough mid-range shots. And I do think some of that is attributed to St. John just not necessarily being prepared for how quickly Braylon gets his shot off. And I think in the second half, they did a much better job on the defensive end, adjusting to the release speed that Braylon has, as well as just putting more athletic guys and lengthier guys guarding him. Dylan Mitchell guarded him for the most of the second half. And there was the one block that Zuby Ejiofor had on one of Braylon's 3-point attempts around the left wing in the second half as well. So I just think that Braylon kind of struggled once he had those lengthier, more athletic guys guarding him, as opposed to when it was Osiah Sellers, Sanan or Ian Jackson guarding him earlier in the game. Now, outside of Braylon in the first half, I thought Solo hit some big shots. I think he had 2 threes in the first half, if I'm not mistaken. Solo finished with 8 points in this game. He just didn't really have it offensively. Again, I think that's attributed to the wrist issues in the shooting hand that, I think that's a big talking point once I get into the Butler recap on this episode, as well as just, I think the confidence. I don't necessarily know that how much that played into his performance, but I definitely think there was opportunities for Solo to look to try to get his shot a little bit more often. I mean, only 8 attempts from the floor in this game, only knocking down 3 total. 2 of them being threes. I just would have liked to see a little bit more aggression out of Solo in this game. I think this could have been a huge turning point for his season. And maybe the Butler game is, which again, I'll get into once we get to that recap. But nonetheless, I thought he defended well for most of the game. I think the one critique, if I can make any, on how he performed defensively was late in the game when Dylan Darling hit the step back off the dribble 3. The defense Solo played on that was not terrible, but I definitely think he could have did a better job of recognizing when Dylan was deciding to shoot and him just making a better effort to close out. So he's more up in Darling's grill as opposed to the honestly clean look that Dylan Darling was able to get off. Mullins, going back to him, he finished 11 points in the game overall. Again, that first half, he was able to hit some tough shots, but he kind of went stagnant and quiet as the game went on for the matchup reasons that I just spoke about. Terrace Reed in this game, I thought was strong early on. You saw him get a few good insert passes to the post where he was able to convert and finish around the rim, and he was getting hyped up. He did the too little after scoring on what I believe was Dylan Mitchell on his second basket of the night. I think that he has to stay out of foul trouble, though, because, fouling was a big issue in this game. The free throw differential was, quite frankly, it was completely in the Johnny's favor. And that's just something that's going to be a theme with UConn this year. They're never going to win the free throw battle just because offensively, the personnel of guys they have on this roster aren't very good at drawing fouls, one, and that just limits your opportunity. And that's part of the reasons why the offense has struggled this year, limiting the amount of free throw attempts you're getting, obviously puts you in a position where you're not going to have those opportunities to get those free points at the line. You're not in a position where you're forcing the other team to foul you when you're beating them on dribble drives, and then you end up in the bonus and you get those additional free throws on top of that. And really, Silas is the only creator off the dribble, and he's the only guy who can get downhill and attack the lane, put pressure on the rim. In terms of the perimeter-oriented players on UConn this year. So that's definitely something that I think we've seen up to this point, probably will continue to see going forward. Just this UConn team isn't great at drawing fouls, but they do still foul a lot on the defensive end. They need to be more disciplined. I think a lot of that is you're getting beat a lot on some of these drives to the rim. I think you're a little bit undisciplined when just trying to square up and put 2 arms up. I mean, putting 2 arms up alone is enough to affect a shot. That's, what we see the most disciplined rim protectors across basketball, any level, do. And I think Terrace tends to hack at times. I think Eric Ryba, who definitely struggled in this game, I'll get to the bench in a little bit, they tend to do that at times. And against a really talented big like Zuby Ejiofor, who I think, or for my money's worth, I think he's the best center in the country. And I just think that, you put yourself in a tough spot when you're fouling that much. And Terrace Reed, obviously, had to be on the floor. And I do think that there was one really critical stretch where Terrace Reed, Braylon, and Silas were all off the floor. And I think that's kind of what led St. John's gaining a lot of momentum. UConn was able to get up to what I believe was a 5, maybe 7-point lead in the midpoint of the first half. And that's just kind of going back to the lack of a killer instinct so far this year. They don't have, they're not in a position where they're able to just close out games and just expand a lead from 7 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. The things that the 23-24 team were just so good at, and just being able to shut the door on opponents early and close out games that way. This UConn team hasn't really done that this year. And outside of maybe a couple games, Creighton, most recently. So that's something that I would like to see going forward. We didn't see that against Butler, nor in this game against the Johnnies. So again, hope it gets there. Got to develop that killer instinct. I do think that you need some more energy for some of the guys on the floor, and I hope to see that going forward. AK in this game, honestly, I think AK had a solid game overall. I thought the one knock which I had on him was when he passed up on a 3 and late in the second half, which I felt he should have just took, and he pump faked, drove to the lane, and kind of, in a way, I think he was searching for the foul call. And granted, probably should have got the call, but nonetheless, drew up a shot and didn't go in. I just think that there was a better shot you could have gotten than that. Again, the free throw differential in this game was pretty extraordinary. If you want to knock on the officiating, sure. I definitely do think that some calls that didn't go UConn's way probably should have but I don't think you can point to that as the main reason why UConn lost in this basketball game. But again, AK, I thought he was decent outside of that one kind of ill-advised drive to the basket. And then the one shot they kind of forced up. But he had 17 points, 7 for 10 overall, knocked down 3 threes in this game. I thought he had decent moments defensively, considering that he was tasked with being switched on to Dylan Mitchell at times, being switched on to Bryce Hopkins at times. But again, I'm honestly more impressed with Caravan than I thought I would be coming out this St. John's game, just because, like I mentioned, I think Caravan tends to struggle when he has more athletic 3-man, 4-man that are guarding him, which Mitchell and Bryce Hopkins are. And I think he honestly had a solid performance overall. Now, before I talk about Silas Demery Jr., I kind of just want to talk about the second half, specifically the stretch where I believe that really kind of led to St. John's being able to win this game. I mean, for one, you have Bryce Hopkins knock down a 3, follow that up with Zuby Ejiofor, who's shooting 20% from 3 this year. He knocks down a 3, puts UConn in a really tough spot. Dylan Darling, the shots he made down the stretch, that double clutch from around the free throw line, that area. I mean, that's just a backbreaker. Some of those shots you kind of, honestly, if you're UConn, you probably live with, but they went in. I mentioned the step back. Dylan Darling hit on solo ball earlier. Dylan Darling's been so crucial for what Rick Pitino and honestly the transformation of the St. John's team this year has been. I honestly don't see an argument to not have him starting going forward, and it still shocks me that Pitino hasn't made that official move. He's playing a starter volume of minutes as opposed to what Ian Jackson's playing. I think Ian Jackson's almost kind of in the doghouse just because I don't think he defends as well as Dylan Darling, which is another point I kind of forgot to bring up. The defensive pressure that St. John's applied to the UConn backcourt in this game was, incredible. Ian Jackson forced up. You picked Silas's pocket in the first half, was able to convert on a transition layup. Dylan Darling in the second half, before Silas could even know what's happening, Dylan Darling picks Silas's pocket, and that leads to a transition basket for the Johnnies. I just think that, again, what Dylan Darling did in forcing UConn to have to run their offense from 35 to 40 feet out when it's very much designed to be ran from right behind the three-point line, put UConn in a tough spot. They were in scramble mode. St. John's loves running the zone press where they take time off the clock, not necessarily to force turnovers, but again, to burn shot clock so that you're in scramble mode. You can't fully run your offense. We all know how elaborate the UConn sets and schemes, the actions that they run, the counters after, counter after counter that they have for every set that they run. And when you're not able to get to that, you're kind of forced to take some of the tough shots, which was the position Silas was in. I think to get into Silas now, you can look at this game from Silas in two ways. On one hand, he was honestly really electric in the second half. And on the other hand, he turned the ball over 9 times. And you're not going to win a basketball game, especially against Rick Pitino, if you turn the ball over 9 times. Now, this was someone that St. John's, Rick Pitino, recruited heavily out of the transfer portal this past offseason cycle. This is someone that Rick Pitino very much wanted, considering how well Silas defends. I mean, he's up for the Naismith Defensive Player of the Year trophy. I've been very vocal on this podcast about why I think he's deserving of that award. But he's someone that Pitino he's watched a lot of film on, he's watched a lot of tape on. They played against Georgia and Silas last year in the Battle for Atlantis. Silas had 10 turnovers in that game. Between those two games, Silas has 19 turnovers against the Johnnies. So this is someone that St. John's has a lot of experience going up against. And it was probably a tough matchup for Silas because of that. And again, the defensive pressure Darling was able to apply in the second half, I think, forced UConn to be in a position where Silas just had to kind of go and take guys one-on-one, pressure the rim, which I think he did a good job at. UConn does not come back in the second half when they went down 10 if Silas doesn't play the way he did when calling his own number, going to score. So, I mean, Silas, just the dunk he had on Zuby Ejiofor, that was one that got me on my seat. And I would like to see him look to do that more often and earlier. I mean, that was what made Tristan Newton so good. He knew in the big games that, okay, I got to show up from tip-off to the final buzzer. And I don't think Silas is there just yet, but I will say you just gotta back him. I mean, he's in his first year, and I think he's done better than anyone, including myself, could have asked for him in terms of where he is right now in his first year playing point guard for UConn. Everyone knows that T New took a while to make the jump to fully understand what it takes to play point guard for Dan Hurley at UConn. And once he did, he obviously never turned back. And I think Silas is definitely progressing towards that point. I think he's further along at this point of the season than T New was in his first year in STORRS. So Silas just needs to look to clean up the turnovers going forward, which he did against Butler. And I'll get into that once we get into that recap. But as well as I think just look to score and be more aggressive when he feels that it's a matchup that calls for it. Now, to talk about the bench really quickly, the bench really was not a factor whatsoever in this game. Jaden Ross, 2 points. I thought that there was an extended stretch of minutes which he was on the floor when I felt he probably shouldn't have been, considering that I just felt the starting five gave you your best chance to win against the Johnnies in this game. Jalen Stewart really was not too much of a factor as well. He only took one shot, which he did hit, but nonetheless, I think you need to look for more production out of those two guys. We've talked about how we've seen big performances off the bench for one of those two guys in certain games this year, and you want to see more consistency out of them in the same game. But until we get that, then that's another reason why this UConn offense has struggled this year. So you look for Ross and Stewie to get going in the same games going forward. Eric Riba struggled in this game, very much looked like a freshman. And I mean, I don't know how much you can ask of him first time matching up against Zuby Ejiofor, who, again, I think is the best center in the country. And I think he's just one he's got to learn from. And I think he will. Really look forward to the rematch in Hartford. I think Eric Riba is going to come back and have a much better performance than what he did at MSG. Malachi Smith. The thing with Malachi Smith is a lot of people get on him for struggling some games, but I very much feel that his success is matchup oriented. St. John's is a tough team for him to match up with physically, just because Malachi's not the biggest guy. St. John's has physically imposing players. They have size, they have length. Dylan Darling isn't super tall, but I do think that he's tough as nails. And I mean, you saw the job he did against Silas. And that was something that I was really I really had my eye on going into the game, because Silas, I think, I felt was going to be able to overwhelm Dylan Darling with the size he possesses at the point. And that was something that honestly did not waver Dylan Darling whatsoever. So that tells you all you need to know about Dylan Darling. And I mean, yeah, again, just St. John's, they executed well down the stretch. This was probably the first time this year that I felt Dan Hurley and UConn were out executed. A lot of that was just, missed free throws, Terrace Reed missing on the and one opportunity where rimmed out, and he proceeds to miss both free throws. Silas Demery misses 2 free throws, which, by the way, I think a lot of the reasons for, I think, some of these turnovers and the missed free throws at the end of the game, you need to remember, I mean, Silas has so much responsibility on his shoulders. He is the point of attack defender on this team, as well as having to shoulder the load of facilitating and running the offense as well. It is slightly worrisome to see how much that wears down on him as the season progresses, but up to this point, he's looked pretty good, and this is probably the first sign of weakness that we've seen him from a facilitating standpoint with the 9 turnovers. So again, I just think that St. John's, they executed down the stretch. The Darling shot at the free throw line, the Dylan Mitchell putback, which is just an incredible show of athleticism from him. I mean, it is what it is. You knew the Giants were going to come out hungry and motivated. This is by far their biggest win to add to the resume. They had not beat a legit program this year until this game against UConn. Of course, the Baylor win has not aged as well as both me and Josh had thought it was going to. You got to tip your cap to Rick Pitino and the Johnnies, because they came to play in this one and they were able to take home the win. Very much looking forward to the rematch in Hartford to come in the next couple weeks. But let's get into the Butler recap now. UConn won 80-70 on the road at Hinkle Fieldhouse. I mean, I think the number one storyline to come out of this game was Solo Ball. Finally got it going. For really the first time since the Villanova game in Hartford, Solo had 24 points, 8 for 14 overall, 6 for 12 from 3. I think most notably, it's the first time we're seeing him without the wrist tape on the left hand, his shooting hand. And I think that tells you that the wrist might be back to normal. We might be getting the old Solo Ball that we know he can be when he is playing at his ceiling. And just seeing him play confident, I think that's such a big thing. I feel like this year, it's been very clear that he has been playing with the level of confidence which he played with last season. And I think that having a game like this is definitely going to give him something to build forward with, just considering the stretch of games you have coming up. On the day you guys are seeing this, UConn will be taking on Georgetown at home in STORRS. And I mean, hopefully that should be one that you win, knock on wood. You get Creighton at home and Gamble as well this Wednesday, again, with how they handled Creighton on the road in Omaha. You like to think that's another win as well that you can add. But then you got Villanova on the road next Saturday, followed up by St. John's in Hartford on Wednesday. This is probably your 2 biggest games of the season going forward in Big East play, just because St. John's is tied for the lead in the Big East right now. And yeah, I mean, you really at this point, you got to win out, I think, to be able to take home the Big East this year with how well St. John's has played with only 1 loss. So, Solo Ball, getting it going in this game. I think that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest takeaway. And he's going to be a driving factor for if the offense can get to the point where it needs to be to be able to go out and get number 7 and cut down the nets in Indianapolis. And I thought Mullins early on hit some big shots. He had 15 points overall with 3 threes. And I just think you're looking for games where you get consistent play out of your stars. Solo's playing well. Braylon's knocking down from beyond the arc. Silas Demery is doing what he does and being able to get his, borderline 10 and 10 every night, which he did in this game. 11 points and 10 assists. I thought he was a lot cleaner and taking care of the basketball. Only 2 turnovers as opposed to the 9 he had against the Johnny. So good seeing Silas get back on the right track. Regarding the turnovers, Terrace Reed, I thought, was stellar in this game. 16 points with 10 rebounds and 7 assists. Never thought I'd see a day where Terrace Reed is getting 7 assists. But just the job he did playmaking out of the post, I thought was a big factor in why UConn was able to pull away late in the game and also kind of get things going offensively when they kind of ran stagnant earlier, or I should say through the midpoint of the first half. One specific play where hit his back to the basket and was able to hit Malachi Smith on a cross pass where he was on the right wing, and Malachi was able to knock that down, which I believe were his first points in the last 3 games. So, you look for the bench to get going. That's hopefully a shot that gets Malachi going forward. Eric Ryba only played 9 minutes in this game. I just think Terrace Reed was so good. Wasn't really in foul trouble. There's no reason to take him off the floor. Jalen Stewart, Jay Ross weren't really the biggest factors in this game. Jay Ross had a really nice shot clock beating 3-pointer, which was definitely a tough shot, but I'm glad seeing Jay Ross have the confidence to let it fly and also seeing him knock it down. Jay Ross, man, he needs to become that legit 3-and-D guy that I've talked about for 2 years now, and I think it's still there. I mean, he's battled the hamstring stuff. He's been in and out of the lineup. I think he just needs to find the consistency both between him and Stewie. Caravan wasn't the biggest factor in this game, but I think it tells you, like, if other guys are playing well, you don't need Caravan to be stellar in every given game. He only had 6 points, wasn't able to knock down any of his 3-point attempts. Again, just being the connecting piece, that's really all you need to ask of Caravan. If guys are balling out the way they did against Butler, then I think you're in a good spot regardless of how AK plays at the end of the day. And I think what really shocked me early on against Butler was I was expecting them to come out a little bit more pedal to the metal following that Johnny's loss at MSG. I just thought Hurley was going to be on the guys, and he honestly wasn't. I think the turnovers were definitely a big problem early on against Butler, but they were able to clean stuff up. Hurley, before he went to the half, talked about how the team had stupid, immature turnovers, and those definitely, I think they remedied that in the second half. So it was good to see, but the turnovers is still definitely a little bit of a concern. Overall, though, I felt they played clean basketball. I think overall they only had 8 turnovers in the game. So I believe they only had 1 or 2 in the second half as opposed to the early 6, which they had in the first. But outside of that, I think that pretty much takes care of what I had to take away from the Butler game. I think while it was close for most of the game, I felt like you never felt that UConn was in a position where they were going to lose. And for them to be able to get the stops and, make the shots that they had to down the stretch to be able to win by 10, I think that tells you that when it's time to turn on defensively, that they can do it. And I think by far the second half performance against St. John's was the worst I've seen the UConn defense at this year in my belief. And I think that they need to look to defend better in some of those bigger games. I think St. John's, the athleticism is definitely something that kind of can expose UConn at times, just because I don't think they have the most athletic nor the best individual defenders. Silas is by far the best, but I think, there's opportunities for other teams to take solo ball one-on-one. There's opportunities for teams to take Braylon Mullins one-on-one, and Braylon's been solid on the defensive end, but again, freshman, someone that a lot of teams are going to target. And Caravan has gotten better year to year, but still not the greatest isolation defender, to say the least. But again, I think seeing Solo get going, that's the number one takeaway for me, because the offense is going to catapult if Solo can do this on a night out basis. I'm not saying he needs to score 24 and have 6 threes every single game, but just for him to be a viable threat from 3, the way he kind of hasn't been this year in terms of how reliable he has been, then that's going to open things up for Braylon. It's going to open things up for Terrace down low. It's going to open things up for Silas. I mean, the shooters are hitting their shots. That spaces the floor out. More opportunities for Silas to take guys one-on-one, which I know, and I think we've all seen up to this point that he is able to do when tasked with it. But that's going to take care of everything on this episode for me today. I'm not sure when the next one is going to be going out. I hope to get one out to you guys on Saturday next week as well, to hopefully preview the Villanova game, as that's a really big one that's being played on the road. I forget if that's at Finneran or at Wells Fargo, but on the day you guys are seeing this, hope the Huskies can take care of business against G-Town and also take care of business on Wednesday night against Creighton. But until the next episode, I'll see you all next time.